The bells of the shrine of the Emperor's unbroken gaze had rung every morning for 312 years without interruption. Through 2 Black Crusades, through the despoilers' fleets, darkening the void above Cadia like a second sky, through siege and counter-siege, and the long, grinding winters when the dead froze where they fell and had to be chipped free of the rockcrete before the rats found them. Through every calamity, the eye of terror had spilled across the Cadian gate. Those bells had rung at dawn, at midday, at dusk, and at the deep middle of the night when faith is thinnest and the darkness pressed closest against the windows. They rang again that morning. We did not yet know they were ringing for the last time. My name is Sister Maren Ossiel, and I have been dead twice. The first time on the dust plains of Casa Partox during the 12th Crusade, a world eater drove a chain axe through my chest cavity and left me in the rubble while he moved on to more interesting prey. I lay there for 6 hours. I watched the battle move away from me, the sounds of it receding, and I had time to think, clearly, without panic, the way you only think when your body has run out of adrenaline and is simply deciding whether to continue, that the Emperor had work for me still, or he didn't, and either way the decision was not mine to make. He had work for me. I recovered. I still carry the chain axe scar across my sternum like a signature, a reminder whose authorship I know. The second time was later, quieter. I was kneeling at a shrine on a dead world in the Agrippina sector, surrounded by silence and the smell of old incense, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone but from feeling, just for a moment, that you are praying into empty space, that the space is simply space, that no one is listening and no one has ever listened, and the prayers are just sounds you make to keep yourself company in the dark. I was dead for approximately 90 seconds. Then the feeling passed, as it always passes for those with sufficient faith, and I completed the prayer, and I rose, and I continued. I tell you this so you understand that I was not a woman given to fear. I had been tested by blade and void and silence, and had remained each time intact. My faith was not the faith of someone who has never doubted. It was the faith of someone who has stood at the edge of doubt and stepped back from it deliberately, eyes open. That kind of faith is a different thing entirely from the faith of the untested. It has weight. It has scars. It was not enough. Nothing was enough. But that is a truth I had not yet been given on the morning the bells rang for the last time. Let me tell you what Cadia felt like in those final hours before we understood what was coming. It felt like the day before a storm you have weathered before. The air had a particular quality to it, a thickness, a weighting. Cadians born reading that air. They read it the way sailors read the sea, instinctively, in their bodies before their minds catch up. Casa Galan, the fortress city where our shrine stood, had the quiet, purposeful energy of a population that had been through this before and knew its role. Soldiers moved to their positions without drama. Families reported to their shelter assignments. The administratum continued to function, because on Cadia, the administratum always continues to function, because stopping would be an admission that this time might be different. The Cadians have a saying. I heard it that morning, muttered by a sergeant passing our shrine gates with his squad at his heels. The gate has held 10,000 years. It will hold 10,000 more. He said it the way you say a prayer, not as information, as armor. I did not think to question it. I had heard it before, on the lips of other soldiers before other crusades, and the gate had held. The saying and the reality had never contradicted each other. I had no reason to believe they would begin now. I was wrong, of course. We were all wrong. But wrongness of that scale is not a personal failure. It is the inevitable result of having lived entirely within a truth that is about to end. The first refugees arrived at the shrine's outer gates before the morning bells had finished resonating. This in itself was not unusual. In the early stages of a crusade, the outlying settlements always produced refugees, families from the smaller casas who had heard the Vox alerts and made the rational decision to move toward the larger fortifications. Our shrine had served as a way station for such people before. We had space, we had food stores, we had, more importantly, the particular comfort of stone and incense and candlelight that frightened people sought, the ancient wordless reassurance of a sacred place. I went to the gates myself to direct their reception. This was routine. I had done it before. Then I saw their eyes and understood that something was different. It is difficult to describe what I mean precisely, because the difference was not any single thing. These were not people who had fled an artillery barrage, still flinching at sounds, still running on the physical memory of danger. They were calm. They were entirely, completely calm. They walked with the particular careful stillness of people who have decided to be very quiet because they do not want to attract attention, except there was nothing behind them to attract attention from. They had outrun whatever they had seen. They were calmed by distance from it. But the eyes. In 23 years of wearing the habit of a battle sister, I had looked into many eyes. I had looked into the eyes of the faithful and the faithless, the dying and the saved, the possessed and the merely terrified. I had looked into the eyes of people for whom hope had become an active effort rather than a natural state. What I saw in the eyes of those refugees was not the absence of hope. It was something more precise. It was the look of people who had seen something that made hope feel like a category error, not people who had given up. People who had encountered a situation so fundamentally outside the parameters of human experience that the usual responses, fear, hope, desperation, prayer, had simply not loaded. The software had found input it wasn't designed to process. The faces were functioning. The eyes were elsewhere. I received them. I set our novices to providing food and medical care. I moved through the crowd myself, speaking the words of comfort that come as naturally to me as breathing, because faith, whatever else it is also a practical technology for managing human terror, and I am skilled in its application. I found myself at the side of an older man, Cadian by his bone structure and his bearing, even sitting on the floor of our shrine atrium, wrapped in a thermal blanket. He sat like a soldier, spine straight, hands visible, some vestigial discipline that had survived whatever he had witnessed. He was perhaps 70. He had the hands of a man who had worked machinery his entire life. He looked up at me. I offered him recaf. He took it, and then he looked at me with those eyes, those elsewhere eyes, and said quietly that he needed to make a confession. I am a battle sister, not a priest. But on Cadia, in crisis, the robes are close enough, and the need is the need regardless of canonical precision. I knelt beside him. I said the opening words of the rite of unburdening. He told me what he had seen. I will not repeat it here. Not because I am unable. I have his words memorized with the terrible precision of things you cannot unhear. But because some knowledge is a weight, and this particular weight, distributed across too many minds, becomes something different, something structural. I will say only that it was not a tale of violence. It was a description of an absence, something that should have been present and was not, something essential, invisible, and irreplaceable, whose removal he had witnessed without understanding, at the time, what he was watching. He understood it now. That was the unbearable part. When he finished, he crossed his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. I completed the rite. I gave the absolution. I placed my hand briefly on his shoulder. Then I stood and walked, with measured steps that I was consciously controlling, to the shrine's outer vestibule, where I could speak privately with Sister Superior Velkanek without being observed by the civilians. I told Vel to seal the outer gates. She read my face. She did not ask questions. She began giving orders. The sky changed at dusk. I want to describe this carefully, because it is important that you understand the difference between what I had seen before and what I was looking at now. I had seen the warp bleed through the veil during the 12th Crusade. I had seen the aurora-like sheens of unnatural light that indicate psychic pressure on the material boundary. The sky above an active war zone, developing colors it has no scientific right to produce. The stars blurring and shifting, as if seen through disturbed water. I knew what a wounded sky looked like. This was not a wounded sky. A wounded sky is a sky in distress. It has integrity. It has a defined location, above this city, above this battlefield, and it has a legible cause. It is the local consequence of a localized event. What I was looking at was not localized. What I was looking at covered the entire sky, from horizon to horizon, in every direction simultaneously, as if the atmosphere itself had changed composition. The light was wrong in a way that was not dramatic, not the lurid purples and greens of demonic incursion, not the violent visual noise of an active warp breach. It was subtle, a shift in the quality of the light that I can only describe as a shift in what the light meant, as though the photons arriving from the sun were the same photons, but had passed through something on their way that had changed them slightly. Not their wavelength, their implication. I was standing on the shrine's outer parapet with Velkanek and two of our senior sisters when I noticed that none of us had spoken in several minutes. We were all simply standing and looking at the sky, not with awe, not with fear, with the particular attention of people whose bodies are trying to tell their minds something their minds are not yet ready to hear. It was Vel who said it first, in the flat tone of someone making a tactical assessment. We've never seen it do that. She was right. In 2 Black Crusades, I had never seen it do that. Below us, the city continued. Soldiers moved, vehicles rolled, the administratum functioned. The great machine of Cadian military civilization performed its routines with the precision of something that has been performing them for 10,000 years and cannot imagine stopping. And above it all, the sky continued its subtle wrongness, its quiet wrongness, its patient wrongness. The first Chaos Artillery fell short of the outer defensive lines by approximately 3 kilometers, fell precisely, deliberately short, detonating against empty rockcrete wasteland with a precision that was almost polite. Then silence. Our own artillery did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. No visible force, no advancing line, no target. Just the single salvo, precisely short, precisely nothing. I understood then what it was. I had read the histories of the earlier Black Crusades, the ones where Abaddon had driven his forces forward with the blunt, furious momentum of a hatred that knew only forward. This was not that. This was a man who had spent 10,000 years learning that hatred is inefficient, that terror is a more durable weapon, and that the most devastating thing you can do to an enemy who has stood against you before is to make them stand again and watch. This time, as everything that saved them before fails to materialize. He wasn't announcing an attack. He was announcing a presence. He was telling us, I am here and I am not hurrying. And I want you to have time to understand what that means. I went down to the vault at midnight. Every shrine of sufficient age on Cadia has a vault. Not a cellar. A vault, which is a different thing. A cellar stores things of material value. A vault stores things of sacred value, which is to say things whose value is real but not material. Things that are worth dying to protect, not because of what they are physically, but because of what they mean to those who believe in them. The shrine of the Emperor's unbroken gaze had, in its vault, a reliquary containing what was certified by 3 separate ecclesiastical inquiries spanning 2 centuries to be a fragment of bone from the hand of Saint Aventine, the Cadian martyr who had held the city of Casamorvan for 40 days against a demonic incursion during the Third Black Crusade, with no supplies and no reinforcement, and who had died at the gate on the 41st day, at the precise moment that imperial reinforcements arrived. The precise moment. The hagiographies made much of this timing, that she had held exactly as long as necessary, and not 1 second more, as though her life had been meted out for a purpose and spent without waste. The bone fragment was small, a proximal phalanx perhaps, the base joint of a finger, cleaned and polished and set in a gold and crystal housing that was worth 10 times its weight in fighting men's lives, and was worth it anyway. Because faith is not a luxury, but a technology. And this was one of its instruments. I had prayed before this reliquary 1,000 times, perhaps more. I had knelt on the cold stone floor of that vault on the mornings before battles, and felt, I want to be precise here, felt something. Not the theatrical warmth of popular devotion, not visions or voices or the pyrotechnics of the ecstatic. Something quieter, a sense of being received, of the prayer landing somewhere rather than dissipating into empty air, a sense of being part of a conversation, even if only one voice in that conversation is audible to human ears. I knelt. I began the litany of the unbroken. I reached the first pause, the place in the litany where you stop speaking and wait, not for a response, but for the space that makes a response possible. And I waited. The silence came, and it was different. I cannot tell you how I knew. This is the problem with describing experiences of faith to those who have not had them. The evidence is entirely interior, entirely subjective, and therefore inadmissible by every standard of rigor I would otherwise apply to a tactical problem. I can only tell you what I know, which is that in 23 years of practice, I had learned to read that silence, the way I had learned to read the eyes of the faithful and the fearful, through pattern recognition so deep in the body that it precedes language. The silence was there. The silence was complete. But for the first time in 23 years, I was not certain what was inside it. Not absent. I want to be careful. I am not saying the Emperor had forsaken us, had turned his face away, had failed in his covenant with humanity. I will not say that. I do not believe that. What I am saying is more precise and in some ways more frightening. The silence felt occupied by something that was listening, but the quality of the listening had changed, as though someone I knew very well, whose silences I could read with the confidence of long familiarity, had come home one day and sat in their usual chair and looked at me from the usual angle. And everything was precisely as it had always been, except that something behind the eyes was not quite the same, and I didn't know how to name it, and I didn't let myself try. I completed the prayer. I rose. I climbed the stairs back to the main shrine floor. The shrine was empty. This requires a moment to understand, because empty is not the word for what I mean. Not simply unpopulated, not simply quiet. The shrine had been, when I descended to the vault, occupied by approximately 60 refugees, 4 of my sisters on overnight watch rotation, 3 priests attending to the vigil candles, and 2 Cadian troopers stationed at the inner doors. The civilian refugees had been sleeping on pallet mats in the atrium. The vigil candles had been burning. The candles were still burning. The pallet mats were still laid out in their rows, still carrying the compressed impressions of bodies that had been sleeping on them. The recaf cups were still on the low table near the east transept, 2 of them still faintly warm. A child's boot, a single boot, the small kind with the Cadian aquila stamped into the toe, sat in the middle of the main aisle, perfectly upright, as though placed there carefully rather than dropped. No sound, no blood, no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no marks of struggle. The doors were sealed from the inside, as I had ordered them. 69 people had not left. They had simply stopped being present. I stood in the doorway to the main nave for what may have been a full minute, running every tactical analysis available to me against what I was seeing, and finding that none of them produced an output consistent with reality. My hand was on the grip of my bolt pistol, without my having consciously moved it there. My breathing was controlled. I am proud of this, looking back, that my breathing was controlled. I walked to the shrine. Systematically, every room, every antechamber, every side chapel and storage alcove. The shrine is not a small building. This took time. I found nothing. I found the absolute pristine negation of 69 people who had been here and were no longer here, who had left every trace of their presence except themselves. I returned to the main entrance. Lying on the floor just inside the sealed gates, which were still sealed, still bolted from inside, still showing no sign of having been opened, was the laser gun of the Cadian trooper who had been standing post at the inner doors. His identification tag was still looped around the barrel where he always hung it. His weapon maintenance kit was still folded beside it, exactly as he had placed it to keep it off the damp floor. I crouched. I placed my hand near the barrel without touching it. Still warm. I straightened. I looked at the sealed gates in front of me. I looked at the main hall behind me. The candles, the pallet mats, the single child's boot standing in the middle of the aisle. And from beneath my feet, from somewhere in the vault below, the vault I had just left, the vault I had been alone in, the vault whose only entrance was the staircase I had just climbed, something moved. Not a sound precisely, a vibration. The stone floor transmitted the presence of something that was no longer alone down there, something that was moving not with the frantic energy of a threat, but with the patient, measured, exploratory movement of something that is learning the dimensions of a space it intends to use. I did not run. I want you to understand that. I have been dead twice, and I am not a woman who runs. But my hand was on the bolt pistol, and my bolt pistol was drawn, and I was backing very slowly toward the far end of the nave, and whatever faith I had brought down into that vault with me was doing something I had never felt it do in 23 years, of wearing it like armor. It was asking questions it had never asked before. The bells were still ringing. Outside on the tower in the dark, the bells of the shrine of the Emperor's unbroken gaze were ringing the midnight litany. I could hear them through the stone walls, their sound unchanged, their rhythm perfect, their voice carrying out across Kassergallen as it had carried for 312 years. I was the only person left in the shrine. There was no one pulling the ropes. Chapter 2. The Weight of Orders. The Vox went silent at 03:47 hours, and Colonel Davin Heth noted the time with the same reflex he used to note everything, not because he thought it would matter, but because 22 years of command had made precision a physical habit, the way a carpenter's hand finds the level without being asked. He noted the time. He noted that all 16 active command channels had gone dead within the same 4-second window. He noted that the silence was not static, not the white noise of interference or the crackling dropout of damaged equipment, but clean, absolute. The kind of silence that isn't the absence of signal, but the presence of something that has replaced it. Then he put the Vox handset down on the command table very carefully, the way you put down something that has just delivered terrible news, and looked at the faces of the 8 officers in the bunker with him, and saw on every face the same expression he could feel on his own. Not fear, not yet, but the specific alertness of professionals who have just encountered a variable that isn't in the manual. Options, he said. He said it the way he said everything, flat even. A voice engineered over 2 decades to communicate that panic was not a resource he had budgeted for and therefore was not available. His officers responded to the voice before they responded to the question. Spines straightened. Hands moved to maps. The instinct to function asserted itself over the instinct to freeze because they were Cadian, and on Cadia, the instinct to function had been selected for over 10,000 years, bred into the bone the way other worlds bred for farming or mining or trade. In 22 years of warfare, I had never heard the Vox go silent. Not like that. Not all at once. Let me tell you about Davin Heth. Not the colonel. Not the decorated veteran of 3 campaigns whose service record reads like a regimental history, whose name is known throughout the Cadian High Command, and among the officers of 3 other Imperial Guard formations who have fought beside the 8th, and remember it with the particular respect soldiers reserve for units that do what they say they will do. Not the man in the briefing room, controlled and precise, moving his companies across tactical displays with the economy of someone who has internalized the truth that every unit marker is people, and people are finite, and the equation must balance. Let me tell you about the man who, in the moments between operations, would walk the lines at night, not inspecting, not performing the theater of leadership that keeps soldiers' morale elevated and their fear managed, though he understood that theater and used it, because it worked, and tools that work should be used. This was something different. He walked the lines the way a man walks the perimeter of something he loves, marking its edges, confirming its existence. The encampments, the gun emplacements, the forward positions, the faces of the troopers on overnight watch. Young faces mostly, the youngest cohort of Cadian conscripts he had ever commanded, because the older men were already dead from the 2 Black Crusades that had preceded this one. He knew their names, all of them. He had a memory for names that his adjutants attributed to discipline, and that was actually something simpler. He just paid attention, in the particular complete way that people pay attention to things they cannot afford to lose. Cadia produces soldiers the way other worlds produce crops. Systemically, inevitably, with the quiet efficiency of a civilization that has organized itself entirely around a single function. Heth had been born into that system and had risen through it and believed in it, not with the fervor of ideology, but with the practical conviction of a man who has seen the alternative and found it unacceptable. The system worked, the gate held, the Imperium persisted. These were not articles of faith, but articles of evidence, and Heth was a man who trusted evidence. He was in this way almost the precise opposite of Sister Marinocial, a man whose certainty was empirical rather than devotional, whose faith was in pattern rather than in presence. He had seen 2 Black Crusades defeated, and had extracted from their defeat a model. Here is how the enemy advances. Here is how they are stopped. Here is what holds, and here is what breaks, and had trusted that model because it had been validated by observable reality. What was happening now was beginning to suggest that the model needed revision. He was not the kind of man who resisted revising models. He was exactly the kind of man who revises them immediately, without sentiment, updating the picture with whatever new data the situation provides. This is what made him exceptional. This is what made him Heth. The model revision, when it came, was going to be catastrophic. But that is what the evidence was for. The 8th Cadian Regiment held a manufacturum district in the mid-zones of Kasr Galan. 6 blocks of heavy industrial infrastructure that had been producing munitions for 300 years and whose thick ferrocrete walls and internal blast partitioning made it one of the more defensible positions in the city's mid-tier. Not glamorous, not the kind of position that gets written about in regimental histories. The kind of position that gets held, quietly, by soldiers who understand that holding is its own form of action, and that the ability to resist glamour in favor of function is one of the things that separates professionals from amateurs. They held for 6 hours. 6 hours of orthodox, disciplined, entirely competent defensive warfare. Incoming fire, absorbed and returned, probing attacks identified and repelled, flanking attempts anticipated and collapsed. The 8th performed exactly as trained, and the manufactorum held, and the position on Heth's tactical display remained the stable, reassuring green of a line that is doing its job. At hour 6, Heth's forward scouts reported a single squad of Black Legion chosen moving through the industrial access corridor on the manufactorum's eastern approach. A single squad, 8 to 12 individuals, on foot, no vehicle support, moving at walking pace, without cover, without apparent tactical formation, as though the concept of cover had simply not occurred to them, or had occurred to them and been dismissed as irrelevant. Heth's forward element, 2 squads, heavy weapons support, well positioned, excellent sight lines, opened fire at 300 meters. At 290 meters, the Chosen were still walking. At 200 meters, Heth received the first frantic Vox report from his forward element, the kind of report that professional soldiers are trained to deliver without the emotional content that would slow it down, delivered by a sergeant who was very clearly applying every gram of that training to keep his voice from doing something his training did not permit. Colonel, they are not. The bolter fire is not. Sir, it's going through them. The rounds are going through them, sir. They are still walking. Heth had heard reports like this before, or reports that sounded like this. High-stress combat descriptions of enemies that would not stop, that had to be shot a dozen times, that seemed to ignore injury. He had always, in previous encounters, discovered a rational explanation. Adrenaline distorting perception, stim-enhanced physiology, chaos-wrought mutations that had redistributed vital organs. There was always an explanation. The equation is always balanced. He issued the order for melter fire. At 150 meters, the Chosen walked through the melter discharge without breaking stride, not without taking damage. Heth's forward observers confirmed visible injury, confirmed that the lead 2 Chosen were structurally compromised in ways that should have constituted incapacitation. They were not incapacitated. They walked through damage that should have stopped them the way men walk through rain that they have decided is not relevant to their schedule. At 100 meters, Heth's forward element broke. He did not blame them. He noted it without judgment. The unit integrity collapsed. The troopers fell back from their positions. The tactical line developed a gap. Because it was relevant information, and relevant information had to be noted regardless of how it arrived. The break was not cowardice. It was the rational response of human nervous systems encountering something that had triggered the deepest, least overridable level of biological threat assessment and found a classification that was not in the human catalogue. Not dangerous. Something prior to danger. Something that made danger feel like a category that still assumed you had options. The manufactorum fell in 9 minutes. Heth did not lose his composure. I want to be precise about this because it matters. The composure did not crack. It adapted. The difference is important. Cracking implies a structure that failed. What Heth did was more controlled than that, more deliberate. He received the information that the manufactorum had fallen, that his forward elements were in disarray, that the tactical situation had changed faster than the model predicted, and he began immediately the process of revision, pulling companies back to secondary positions, re-establishing communication lines between his surviving units, assessing what remained of the district that could be held and what had to be conceded. He was very good at this. He was arguably doing the best that was possible. The problem, and he was only beginning to understand this, only beginning to feel the edges of it, the way you feel the edges of a room you have entered in complete darkness, was that the best that was possible might not be a meaningful category anymore. The Vox silence continued. He had dispatched 2 runners to the regimental command post 2 kilometers north. Neither had returned. He had dispatched a 3rd to the nearest administratum relay station to request emergency frequency access. The runner had returned promptly with the information that the relay station was still fully operational and that all frequencies were clear and open and that there was simply nothing transmitting on any of them. The runner had said this with the bewildered precision of a man who has been asked to report that the lights are on, but no one is home, and has done so, and is waiting for this to mean something that will give him back the context he has lost. Heth had thanked him and sent him back to his post. The silence had a shape to it. He was beginning to feel that shape the way you feel the shape of something large in dark water, not seeing it, but aware of the displacement it causes, the way it moves the current around it. The command structure above him had not gone quiet because it had been destroyed. Destruction was loud. Destruction left debris. This was different. This was absent. The entire apparatus of Imperial Guard Command. The officers, the adjutants, the administratum functionaries who kept the paperwork flowing even during active engagement, because the paperwork was how the Imperium confirmed to itself that it was still the Imperium. All of it had simply stopped producing output. He was, it was becoming apparent, operating without a ceiling. Heth had operated without a ceiling before. Any sufficiently experienced field commander develops the capacity to function autonomously when communication breaks down, because communication always breaks down eventually, and soldiers who can only fight with explicit instructions are soldiers who will one day stop fighting at the worst possible moment. He had the training, he had the experience, he had the disposition. What he had not had in previous autonomous operations was the growing understanding that the silence was not a technical failure, that it was a result. He found the remnants of the 6th Cadian at 0600 hours in the secondary industrial zone 3 blocks east of his fallback position. He smelled them before he saw them. Not blood, not smoke, not the chemical signatures of weapons discharge, but something he couldn't identify immediately. Something that arrived in the nose as wrongness before the brain had time to classify it. Sweet, slightly, in the way that wrongness often is when it's biological rather than physical. The smell of something that has changed. He came around the corner of a collapsed wall with his command squad at his heels, and he saw the 6th Cadian, or rather, what was standing in the place where the 6th Cadian should have been. There were perhaps 40 of them, an intact platoon, which was itself remarkable, because he had received reports of the 6th taking significant casualties in the Manufacturum district engagement. They should have been depleted, ragged, the particularly exhausted functional wreckage of soldiers who have fought hard and fallen back and are now doing the arithmetic of their losses. They should have looked like soldiers after a battle. They did not look like soldiers after a battle. They were standing at attention, perfect attention, heels together, spines straight, chins level, arms at their sides in precisely the regulation position. Their uniforms were undamaged. Their weapons were at their sides. They were facing east, which was the direction the enemy was coming from, and they were not facing the enemy with the ready posture of a defensive line. They were facing it the way you face something you are waiting for, something expected, something invited. Their eyes were open. Heth stopped. His command squad stopped behind him. No one said anything. The 40 soldiers of the 6th Cadian did not turn, did not acknowledge the sound of footsteps and equipment behind them, did not react to presence in any way. They simply stood, in perfect formation, facing east, in the particular absolute stillness of people who are no longer doing stillness as a choice, but as a state. Heth had seen the dead stand before. He was a veteran of campaigns that included demonic incursion. He knew the mechanics of post-mortem animation, the puppet work of warp entities using flesh as vehicle. He was not unacquainted with this category of horror. But the dead don't breathe. The 6th Cadian was breathing. He could see it. The slight rise and fall of 40 chests, perfectly synchronized, every soldier inhaling and exhaling on the same cycle. Together, one rhythm, as though they had been synchronized to something external, like a clock, like a signal, like a heartbeat that was not their own. Heth's adjutant touched his arm and pointed silently at the nearest soldier's face. Heth looked. The soldier, he recognized him, a corporal named Ediz, 26 years old, 3 campaign bars on his collar, a man who Heth had personally commended 6 months ago for extraordinary composure under fire. Corporal Ediz was smiling. A small smile, patient, private. The smile of someone who knows something and is waiting with complete contentment for the moment when everyone else knows it too. All 40 of them were smiling that smile. Heth looked at the smile for precisely as long as it took him to understand that he was not going to receive any information from it that he was equipped to use. And then he turned his command squad around and moved them out at a measured pace that he was very deliberately not permitting to become a run. He did not run. He noted the location in his tactical log. He noted the time. He kept walking. The child was sitting in the rubble of a collapsed HAB structure, approximately 400 meters from his current fallback position, and Heth saw her from distance before he saw her clearly, and for a moment, just a moment before the resolution arrived, he thought she was wounded, sitting in the particular hunched stillness of a civilian who has taken shrapnel and is doing the quiet internal arithmetic of injury. Then he saw she was not hunched. She was sitting neatly with the alert, composed posture of a child who has been told to sit and wait and has taken the instructions seriously. She was perhaps 8 years old, Cadian by the look of her, the dark eyes, the broad cheekbones, the particular physical density of people who have been building bodies for hard work in cold weather for 10,000 years. Her clothes were dirty but undamaged. Her face was dirty but uninjured. In her lap, resting across her knees with the careful handling of a child who has been taught to respect what weapons mean, was a las pistol. An officer's las pistol, the personal issue kind, the grip worn smooth with long use, the charge pack indicator still showing 70%. Not a child's weapon. Not a weapon that had any business being in a child's hands. Heth approached. His command squad spread to either side without being told. Not flanking, just spacing. The instinctive tactical adjustment of soldiers who have operated together long enough to process an unfamiliar situation collectively and distribute themselves around it. He stopped 3 meters from the child. She looked up at him. Her face was her face. He was certain of this, certain that the face looking up at him was a child's face, operating with a child's muscles, expressing what a child's face expresses. There was nothing in the face itself that was wrong. He had been looking at wrong faces all morning, at eyes that were elsewhere, at smiles that belonged to something other than the mouths wearing them. This face was not like that. The eyes were hers. He was sure of it. He had looked into too many wrong eyes today to be uncertain about the difference. But the stillness was not a child's stillness. The particular quality of her composure, the settled, patient, completely undisturbed quality of it. Here, in the rubble of a city under siege, with artillery cycling somewhere to the north and the smell of burning metal in the air, was not how children were still. Children were still the way animals are still before bolting. This child was still the way a message is still, waiting to be delivered. She said, "He told me to wait here for you."
Heth said, "Who did?"
She said it the way children state corrections, without cruelty, simply supplying a fact he was missing. "Specifically for you, Colonel. He knew you'd come this way." Heth's hand had moved to his sidearm. He was aware of this. He had not consciously initiated the movement. His body had made a threat assessment and acted on it before his command authority over his own actions had caught up. He noted this too. He noted everything. "Who told you to wait for me?" he said. She smiled. It was not the smile of the sixth Cadian. It was not patient and private, and turned inward towards some knowledge she was sitting with. It was a child's smile, open, slightly uncertain, the smile of a child who has been given a task and is proud of having completed it. That was when it was the worst. That the smile was genuinely hers. "He said you'd ask that," she said. "He said to tell you that you already know the answer. You just haven't asked yourself the right question yet." She tilted her head slightly. A child's gesture, authentic and unmistakable. "He said the right question isn't who. He said the right question is how long." Heth said nothing. The child looked at him for a moment more, and then her eyes moved to something behind him, something over his shoulder, and her expression changed from the composed pride of a delivered message to something that might have been relief, or recognition, or both. Heth turned. From the smoke that had been sitting against the end of the street for the past hour, dense and still and grey-white in the early morning light, his soldiers were emerging. His soldiers. The 8th Cadian. Men he had led for years. Men whose names he knew, whose service records he could recite, whose families he had in some cases met on the rare planetary leave rotations that Cadia's deployment schedule permitted. Sergeant Vile, who had the picture of his mother folded behind his identification tag and had never mentioned it and didn't need to. Corporal Thassain, who was 21 years old and moved through urban terrain with the eerie fluid confidence of someone who had been born to it. Lieutenant Caspar, steady and dry and permanently, mildly contemptuous of dramatics in any form. They were emerging in formation, perfect formation, dressed right, maintaining interval. Their weapons were at their sides, their uniforms were undamaged, they were facing him. Not easy. Him, specifically. All of them, together. The whole surviving strength of the 8th Cadian, emerging from the smoke at a walking pace, in lockstep unison, with their eyes open and their chins level and on every face. He read them one by one. He could not stop himself from reading them one by one, names and faces and 22 years of accumulated knowledge. On every face, the same small, patient smile. 30 meters, 25, still walking, still the same pace, still that rhythm, the synchronized breathing, the unified step, the one heartbeat that wasn't theirs. Heth's sidearm was in his hand. He had not noted the moment he drew it. He noted it now. Behind him, the child in the rubble was standing. He could hear her, her footsteps, her breathing, moving up to stand just behind his left shoulder, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. He did not turn around. He did not take his eyes off his soldiers. 20 meters. The muzzle of his sidearm was up, and it was level, and it was finding targets the way his body had always found targets, automatically, without hesitation, without the lag of conscious aiming. He had been shooting since he was 8 years old. He had been doing this one specific thing for 22 years. His body knew exactly what to do. His hand would not close. 15 meters. The smile on Sergeant Vale's face, the smile on Corporal Thessane's face. I am 21 years old. The faces of people he had protected, had built, had carried in his memory as the specific human weight of his command's meaning. His hand would not close. 10 meters. Behind him, very close, Kale's voice. The child's voice, her voice, genuinely hers. He said the right question is how long? And Colonel Davin Heth, who had held composure through the Vox silence and the Manufactorum and the 6th Cadian and 22 years of everything the Eye of Terror had sent against Cadia's walls, felt something in his chest collapse. Not break, not fracture, but collapse. The way a structure collapses when the thing it was built around is no longer present. Quietly, completely, without drama. He said a word. One word, barely audible, directed at no one. Or rather directed at everything. At the city and the sky and the campaign and the model that was no longer valid, and the names on the roster and the picture folded behind a dead man's identification tag. He said, "Please," and did not fire. And the 8th Cadian reached him. The Vox stayed silent. 3 kilometers north, in the Administratum relay station, that was still fully operational and receiving on all frequencies, the night duty operator sat at her console in the complete clean silence of every channel open and transmitting nothing. At 0631 hours, something transmitted. She had been waiting all night for something to transmit. She reached for the handset. She listened for 11 seconds. Then she set the handset down. Then she folded her hands on the console, very neatly, and looked at the wall, and smiled. Chapter 3. Something that remembers. I have been blind before, not the blindness of the body. My physical eyes have always functioned within acceptable parameters, which is to say they register light and depth and the material facts of whatever space I occupy, and they do this reliably. And I have never had cause to depend on them for anything more than confirmation of what my other senses have already told me. A Space Marine librarian does not navigate the world primarily through his eyes. He navigates it through the witch sight, the psychic sense, the perception that runs beneath the physical senses, the way a river runs beneath ice, present and powerful, and doing the actual work while the surface performs its cosmetic function. The witch sight is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual feeling or a heightened intuition dressed in mystical language for the benefit of those who need mystery to justify what they cannot quantify. It makes sense. It receives information. It processes information. It has resolution and range and depth, the way physical sight has resolution and range and depth, and it can be trained and refined and pushed toward precision through 4 centuries of application, which is what I had done with it. 4 centuries. I want you to hold that number for a moment, because it matters for what follows. 400 years of learning to see the warp, the way a cartographer learns to read terrain. Not with wonder, not with fear, but with the working familiarity of a professional instrument turned toward a professional problem. I had seen things through the witch sight that would have liquefied the minds of ordinary men. I had developed, over 4 centuries, the ability to look at those things without flinching, to classify them, to act on that classification, to move on. I was not a man given to flinching. When I tell you that what I saw above made me afraid, I need you to understand precisely what that means precisely. Not the fear of the untested, not the fear of the man who has never looked into the warp and finds it terrible because all new things are terrible until they become familiar. The fear of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at and has spent 400 years building a vocabulary for it and is now looking at something for which that vocabulary has no words. That kind of fear is a different animal entirely. That kind of fear means something is genuinely wrong. My name is Epistolary Calthus of the Ultramarines. I am 411 years old. I have faced things that do not have names in any language that humans have developed, in any age, in any tradition. I have faced them, and I have held, and I have returned. I was not certain I would return from this. Let me tell you what I saw. The witch site was damaged. I should establish this first, because it shaped everything that followed, and because its damage was itself informative. A diagnostic symptom that told me something about what was happening above Cadia that my physical eyes could not. The damage had come during an engagement the previous evening. A sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, which is to say, an opponent of genuine psychic sophistication, not the blunt instrument chaos touched that populated the bulk of the Black Legion's ground forces, but a practitioner of real ability, schooled in the arts of the warp, with the patient dedication of a species that has been doing nothing else for 10 millennia. We had exchanged forces in the psychic sense. He had pushed, I had held. He had pushed harder, I had pushed back. And at the moment of my counter, the backlash had arrived with a precision that suggested it was intended, that the sorcerer had been less interested in defeating me than in delivering a specific injury. He had known exactly where to strike. He had known the precise architecture of my psychic defenses, not just that defenses existed, which any opponent would assume, but the specific structural layout, the particular way I had built my mental fortress over 4 centuries, the location of the load-bearing walls. He had not tried to knock the fortress down. He had removed a single stone from the foundation with surgical precision and let the vibration do the rest. The witch site was not gone. It was occluded, as though a membrane had been drawn across it, thin enough to transmit some information and opaque enough to distort the rest. I could see through it, partially. What I could see was enough. The warp above Cadia was not doing what the warp does during a conventional chaos incursion. I have witnessed 7 Black Crusades in my 4 centuries of service. Have witnessed them at ground level, from orbit, from the command decks of capital ships where the tactical displays painted the scale in abstractions, and the witch site painted it in truth. I knew what a Black Crusade looked like from the inside of the Immaterium's pressure. I knew its textures, its rhythms, its particular flavor of wrongness. This was not that. This was not the warp being directed, not the channeled, weaponized application of chaos energy that a Black Crusade typically represented, the psychic equivalent of artillery aimed at a specific target. This was the warp being released, like pressure behind a dam that the dam has been holding for 10,000 years and is holding no longer. Not a breach, a dissolution. Not someone opening a door, but the door and the wall and the concept of the boundary between inside and outside, becoming, gradually, a matter of perspective rather than fact. The Cadian pylons. I need to speak about the pylons here, because without understanding them you cannot understand the horror of what I was perceiving. And this story is about understanding, about the terrible utility of understanding things you would prefer not to understand. The pylons were ancient beyond any imperial reckoning, pre-human, pre-Eldari possibly. Enormous structures of an unknown material embedded in Cadia's crust at precisely regular intervals, their geometry suggesting a design intelligence that operated at cosmological rather than architectural scales. For 10,000 years, the Imperium's Adeptus Mechanicus had studied them, catalogued them, run every analysis their considerable methodological apparatus could produce, and arrived at the same inconclusive conclusions that all previous analysts had arrived at. Unknown origin, unknown material, unknown mechanism, unknown purpose. The purpose was not unknown to a sufficiently sensitive psyker who stood among them with the witch site open. The pylons were, I'm going to use a word that is not precise but is the least imprecise available, suppressing the warp. not blocking it, not separating the material from the immaterial in the blunt, finite way that a physical barrier separates two substances. Something more fundamental. Something that operated on the nature of the warp's relationship to material space in this region, dampening the permeability between them, maintaining a kind of local reality that was, and this is the part that matters, the part that should have been studied and understood and acted upon centuries ago, artificially stable. Reality as we experience it, the solidity of matter and the reliability of physical law, and the basic premise that what is real and what is not real, was a condition that was being maintained in the Cadian Gate by technology we did not build and did not understand and had never adequately protected. And Abaddon knew this. He had always known this. 10,000 years of Black Crusades. 10,000 years of apparently failing to hold the territory he won, apparently failing to consolidate his gains, apparently failing to do the one obvious strategic thing any competent warlord would do, had not been failure. They had been reconnaissance, survey missions. Each crusade probed the defenses, not of the imperial military, but of the pylons, learning their range, their capacity, their limits, learning what it would take to bring them down. 10,000 years of patience from a mind that understood that the correct target was never the armies defending Cadia, but the stones beneath them. When I understood this fully, when the witch sight, even occluded, gave me enough of the picture to complete it, I sat with the understanding for a long moment. 10,000 years. He had been planning this for 10,000 years. The armies we were throwing at his forces, the brave, competent, utterly dedicated soldiers of Cadia and the Imperium, the Battle Sisters and the Shock Troopers and the Space Marines and the Naval Fleet, were not the problem he needed to solve. We were the gardeners. The pylons were the soil. He had never been trying to defeat us. He had been trying to kill the ground we stood on. The memory is missing from 0312 hours to 0353 hours. 41 minutes. I discovered this at 0354 hours, when I became aware that I was standing at the edge of the defensive perimeter's northernmost point, facing the enemy lines across approximately 800 meters of open rubble, in a location I had no memory of deciding to go to. Having apparently walked there, my suit's motion tracking confirmed the route. From the command bunker over a period of about 12 minutes. I was standing. I was not injured. My weapons were at my sides, undrawn. The psychic wards I maintained as a matter of continuous discipline, the constant low-level workings that serve as both early warning and passive defense, were intact, which told me that whatever had occurred during those 41 minutes had not been a hostile psychic engagement that I had lost. I had not been attacked and overcome. The wards would have shown that. Something else had happened. I returned to the command bunker with the measured pace of someone who is controlling their pace deliberately. I ran the diagnostics available to me. I reviewed my suit's sensor logs, which recorded environmental data continuously: temperature, atmospheric composition, pressure, radiation, and found nothing anomalous for the period in question, except for a 17-second window at approximately 0331 hours, during which every sensor had recorded a simultaneous spike to maximum range and then returned to baseline. Every sensor, simultaneously, as though the environment had, for 17 seconds, become something that the sensor's maximum calibration was insufficient to measure, and then had returned to normal. I reviewed the war log record of my physical movements. I had walked, in those 41 minutes, to the perimeter. I stood there. I had not moved from the spot for approximately 28 minutes. Then I walked back. The gate analysis showed nothing unusual, not the mechanical lockstep of the 6th Cadian that other reports were describing. Not any indication of external motor control. I had walked normally. I had stood normally. I had walked back normally. I had simply not been present for any of it. The mind has an integrity to it, a continuity, a thread of experience that runs from moment to moment and constitutes the first-person fact of existing. In 411 years, that thread had never broken, not in the heat of psychic battle, not under the most extreme sensory assault the warp had ever delivered to me, not in the rare moments of deep meditation where consciousness deliberately loosens its grip on the immediate. The thread had always been there. Always. For 41 minutes, it had not been there. Something had removed it. I sat with this. I did the disciplined work of not letting the implications destabilize the function I needed to maintain. I was still needed. The defense of the perimeter still required my contribution. There were still things I could do, and I had 4 centuries of practice doing them under adverse conditions. And the thing that had happened to my memory, whatever it was, had happened, and I was still operational, and operational was what mattered. I started the work of reconstructing the missing time through psychic memory reading. This is a technique I had used before, primarily in the context of extracting information from the recent memories of others. The reverse engineering of recorded experience, reading the psychic impressions that intense events leave in their surroundings, the residue of consciousness that persists briefly in spaces where significant things have occurred. I had never attempted to read my own missing time. I reached toward it carefully, into the gap where the 41 minutes should have been, into the clean, smooth absence that occupied the space between 0312 and 0353. The absence was not empty. I want to describe this precisely, because precision is all I have left, and precision matters here more than anywhere else in this account. When I reached toward the gap, I found not a memory, not a recording, not a psychic impression in any form I had previously encountered. What I found was a presence, something that had been left there in the negative space of my missing time, the way a letter is left in a box, not aggressive, not hostile, patient, waiting, with the specific patience of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has made its peace with the duration. I touched it with my witch sight, and it turned toward me. That is the only language I have for it. It turned toward me the way an eye turns toward movement. Not a body turning, not a head turning, just the attention behind the eyes shifting to include a new object in its field. Something that had been looking elsewhere, looking at many things simultaneously, across a span I could not measure, added me to what it was looking at. I am 411 years old. I have looked into the warp and seen things that have no analog in material existence, things that operate on scales and in modes that human cognition was not built to contain. And I have contained them anyway through the application of training and discipline and the sheer accumulated weight of 4 centuries of refusing to break. What I felt in that moment was not terror. I want to be precise. Terror implies a response calibrated to an immediate threat, to something that is about to cause harm. What I felt was smaller than terror and larger. Smaller because it was quiet, because it arrived without drama or force or pressure. Larger because of what the quietness meant, because the quietness was the quietness of a vast thing that has no need to assert itself, that is not performing its power because it has nothing to prove, because what it is simply what it is and will be what it is regardless of whether you are frightened of it. It had been watching me, not for 41 minutes, not since the beginning of the campaign. I would not insult the reality of what I perceived by understating its duration. It had been watching me for 411 years. The sense of this arrived not as information, not as data transmitted through the psychic connection, but as the simple, direct, devastating knowledge that comes when you touch something that is older than language and read it directly beneath the level of words. It had been watching me since I first opened the witch site, since I first reached into the immaterium as a young and barely trained psyker and felt the warp respond to my presence. Since the very first moment I had been visible to anything that looked through the warp at the material world. It had been watching me the way I searched for the analogy and found only one that fit. The way you watch something you have made, something you have built or shaped or guided at a distance, with a form of investment that does not need to interfere to be real. Watching me grow, watching me develop, watching me become, over 4 centuries, the specific instrument I had become. And it was fond of me. This was the worst thing. Worse than hostility would have been. Worse than malice. Worse than the cold indifference of the warp's greater entities, which I had encountered before and which were terrible in their own way but were at least consistent, at least comprehensible as a form of opposition. This was not opposition. This was not even acknowledgement in any sense that treated me as an equal or an enemy or anything that required response. It was a fondness. The fondness of a vast thing for a small thing it has watched for a long time. The fondness of something that experiences time so differently from a human being that 411 years feels, from its perspective, like watching a candle's entire life. The lighting, the burning, the gradual progress toward the end, in the span of an afternoon. I pulled back from the touch. I withdrew the witch sight from the gap in my memory with the controlled speed of a hand withdrawing from a fire. Not panicked, deliberately measured, because panic in that space would be the last mistake I ever made. The presence did not follow, did not pursue, did not increase its pressure in any way. It simply returned to looking at everything else it was looking at, adding me back to the field of its attention, the way you note a candle you are fond of, still burning, still doing what candles do. I will speak now about what the witch sight showed me of the warp's condition above Cadia as the day progressed, because it is important, because it illuminates what was coming in ways that the military reports will not capture, because military reports describe armies and ordnance and territorial control, and the warp cares about none of these things. The Astronomicon was drowning. I have described this to other psychers since, in the years after Cadia, and the ones who have never fought in a major Black Crusade struggle with the image, because the Astronomicon is, in normal circumstances, not something a psyker perceives as drowning or not drowning. It is simply present. It is the constant, the given, the fixed star by which all psychic navigation is calibrated. The beacon of the Emperor's will made immaterially real, projecting from Terra across the full breadth of the galaxy like a lighthouse whose light has been burning for 10,000 years without interruption, without diminishment, without doubt. You don't perceive it the way you perceive other things. You perceive it the way you perceive it. It is the orientation underneath all other orientations. It is the thing that tells you which way is real. Above Cadia, on that day, I could feel it. I could feel it clearly and distinctly, which should have been reassuring and was not, because feeling it distinctly meant feeling it against resistance, the way you only feel the weight of a thing you carry when you are fighting something trying to take it from you. The Astronomicon was still there. It was being pushed, not blocked. Nothing that simple, nothing that finite. The pressure against it was the pressure of the warp itself expanding, the Eye of Terror using the degradation of the pylons to spread into regions of space that the pylons had been suppressing, each incremental expansion reducing the Astronomicon's effective dominance over the local immaterium by a small fraction. Small fractions, accumulated over time, become large fractions. Large fractions in this particular equation become darkness. I watched it happen across the course of that day. I watched the warp press and the Astronomicon hold, and the pylons fail incrementally, and the balance shift in the particular unstoppable way that balances shift, when the mechanism that has been maintaining them is being disassembled piece by piece, with 10,000 years of accumulated understanding of how it was assembled. I watched the light thin, not going out, not yet, not that day, thin, the way the sky thins at the end of autumn, each day perceptibly shorter than the last, each evening a fraction darker, the cold arriving not in a moment, but in a direction, and somewhere in the warp, connected to the presence I had touched, connected to the eyes that had watched me for 4 centuries, connected to everything that was happening to Cadia at scales I could perceive and scales I could not. Somewhere in there, vast and patient and fond of the small burning things it had been watching for longer than the Imperium had existed, something was content, not triumphant. Triumph implies contest. This was not a contest. It was a process, moving at its own pace toward its own completion. I recorded a final log entry at 21:47 hours. I want to be accurate about my state at this point, because accuracy is what I owe to whoever eventually receives this record. I was functional. I was clear. 4 centuries of mental discipline had not deserted me, and the damage to the witch site, while still present, had not worsened since morning. I was, by any objective measure, a combat-effective Space Marine librarian still capable of contributing meaningfully to the defense of the perimeter. I was also aware that the presence I had touched in the gap of my missing memory had not left. It had not re-entered the gap. It had not attempted anything I could classify as intrusion or influence. But it was there, in the way that something very large is there, even when it is not acting, even when it is simply occupying the same space as you and making no demands. I was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound you have been hearing so long you stopped registering it, and then it stops, and the cessation is a presence of its own, except in reverse. Something that had always been there, always been in the background of every moment of my 400-year existence, had stepped slightly closer, had made itself known, had let me know it had always been there. I recorded the tactical situation. I recorded my recommendations for the defense of the northern perimeter. I recorded my assessment of the pylon's status and the psychic implications of their continued degradation, which I had been transmitting to command throughout the day, and which I was transmitting again here for completeness. I spoke clearly. I used precise language. I said what I meant. Then I reached the end of what I meant to say, and I paused, and in the pause something happened that I can describe only as an opening, some door in me that I had been holding shut, that the day's accumulated weight had weakened to the point where holding it required more than I had left, that opened, not violently, not under external force, but with the quiet inevitability of a thing that was going to open eventually, and had found its moment. And in the space of the 3 seconds before the recording ended, I said something. I did not plan to say it. It arrived in me the way some things arrive, not from thought but from somewhere beneath thought, from the level where 400 years of perceiving the warp had laid down strata of knowledge that had never been converted into language, because language was insufficient to hold them. And that rose now, in this moment, in this 3-second gap, as a question. Not in Imperial Gothic, not in any language that has been spoken aloud since before the age of strife, and which I had no conscious knowledge of, and which I said anyway because the mind, when it is pushed to its limits, sometimes finds it has learned things it was never taught. A question. The oldest question a conscious being can ask, in any age, in any civilization, in any species that has ever been aware enough of its own existence to wonder about it. The recording ended. There are things I am not going to tell you. I am not going to tell you what I asked. I am not going to tell you what answered. I am not going to tell you what I understood in the hours after that recording that made fighting feel not wrong, not futile, but like the wrong scale of response to what I had learned. Like a man who has been shown the sun for the first time, reaching for a candle to illuminate it. I am going to tell you what I did. At 0213 hours, 5 hours after the recording, I was still at the perimeter. I had not slept. Space Marines do not require sleep in the conventional sense, though we require the Susan meditation that serves its function. I had not meditated. I had been standing at the perimeter, watching the advance of Abaddon's forces with the witch sight half open, maintaining the wards, doing the work. I was still doing the work. I will not stop doing the work. This I want to say clearly and without ambiguity. Whatever I understood, whatever I was shown, whatever vast and patient thing looked back at me when I opened that door, none of it changes what I am or what I am for, or the 4 centuries of oath that define the shape of my existence. Understanding a thing is not the same as accepting it. Witnessing a thing is not the same as surrendering to it. I held the perimeter. I will hold it until I cannot. But I want you to understand, to hold in your mind clearly, as you hear what follows in this record, that what I touched in the gap of my missing memory was not an enemy. That is the thing I cannot make peace with. Not the scale, not patience, not even the fondness, though the fondness was terrible in its way. The thing I cannot make peace with is this. It was not an enemy. It was something else entirely, and I do not yet have the language for what that means. At 0317 hours, something repeated the question I had asked. Not to me. To every psyker on Cadia simultaneously, in the same dead language, in the same cadence, at the same volume. In the command bunker, 3 astropaths fell silent mid-transmission. In the Medici ward, 2 wounded psychers sat up in their beds. Across the perimeter, a young sanctioned psyker attached to the 8th Cadian lowered his weapon and turned his face toward the sky and said, in a language he had never learned, a single word. The word was the answer to the question. I knew the word. I did not speak it. I held the perimeter. I held the perimeter. I held the perimeter. Chapter 4. The Arithmetic of Saints. My daughter's name was Kale. She was 9 years old. She had a gap between her 2 front teeth that she was self-conscious about and that I thought was the best thing in the world. She liked the sugar coating on ration blocks, not the blocks themselves, which tasted like compressed cardboard soaked in synthetic protein, but the thin, sweet glaze on the outside, which she would lick off carefully before eating the rest, with the resigned practicality of a Cadian child who understood that food was fuel and sentiment about it was a luxury. She had her father's eyes and my hands, broad across the palm, short-fingered, the hands of people who fix things. She had been reading since she was 4. She asked questions that made me stop what I was doing and sit down and think before answering, because she would know if I gave her a half answer, and she thought half answers were a form of disrespect. She was 9 years old, and she was the most real thing I had ever encountered. I'm telling you this first, before anything else. Before the siege and the shelters, and what happened in the streets, and the choice at the end that I am still carrying and will carry until I die. I'm telling you her name and her teeth and her hands and the way she ate ration blocks, because by the time I finish speaking, you are going to know exactly what this war cost. Not the regiment, not the world, her. My name is Isolde Kea. I am 41 years old. I am a grade 3 cogitator maintenance technician, assigned to the Administratum Processing Hub in Casa Galan's civilian mid-district, a title that means, in practical terms, that I keep machines thinking when they would rather stop, that I understand the language of mechanical failure, that I am comfortable in the spaces between walls and beneath floors where the infrastructure lives and no one thinks to look. I am not a soldier. I want to say this clearly, not as a disclaimer, but as a precision. I have lived in Cadia my entire life. I know what soldiers are. I know the particular quality they have, the specific way they occupy space, the way they assess rooms and angles without appearing to, the way they hold themselves in readiness that has become so habitual it has become rest. I am not that. I have never been like that. I am the other kind of Cadian, the one who keeps the machines running so the soldiers have power and light and heat and the 10,000 mundane necessities that war requires and that no one mentions in the regimental histories. There is a version of this story, the version the Ministorum would tell, the version the Departamento Munitorum would enter into the official record, in which I am background, context, the civilian population whose protection and eventual evacuation represents a logistical variable in the larger strategic equation. The record would note civilian casualties in aggregate, in numbers, in the impersonal plural that turns people into data, and data into something that can be filed and processed and stored in an archive where it troubles no one. I am not going to tell you that version. I am going to tell you about one woman and one child, and one day, and the weight of what that day left behind. Because that weight is the real accounting, and it does not fit in any archive, and it should not. Let me tell you what Cadian civilian life looked like the morning the sky changed. I want to describe this carefully, because there is a tendency, I have seen it in the accounts of soldiers, in the hagiographies of the battle sisters, in every imperial record of the Black Crusades, to render the civilian experience of siege as either heroic suffering or passive victimhood. And it was neither. It was something more mundane and more dignified than either of those framings allow. We had drills. Of course we had drills. Cadia has been under intermittent siege for 10,000 years. The civilian population does not experience this as crisis the way populations on other worlds might, because crisis implies departure from a norm, and on Cadia, this was the norm. Every Cadian child, by the age of 6, knew the shelter protocols. Which routes, which depth, which hub, which identification to carry, what to bring and what to leave. Kyle had known them since she was 4. She had memorized them the way she memorized everything, completely, with the particular focused attention she gave to things she had decided were worth understanding. I heard the alert at 0600 hours, the long tone, 3 pulses, the code for confirmed enemy contact within the outer defensive line, and I was already moving before the second pulse finished. This is not heroism, this is drilling. Heroism is a choice made under novel circumstances. This was muscle memory, 12 years of practicing a sequence that the sequence had finally made real. I had a bag, pre-packed, pre-checked, updated every 6 months in accordance with the District Shelter Authority's current recommended contents. I had the identification chits, mine, Kyle's, the pre-completed administratum forms that would register us at the shelter hub and establish our claim on ration allocation and medical access. I had the small toolkit that I carried everywhere out of professional habit and that I was aware might be useful if any of the shelter's mechanical systems needed attention. I had the photograph. One photograph, physical print, sealed in a card envelope. Cale's father, who had died in the 12th Black Crusade when Cale was 3, in the particular useful impersonal way that soldiers die in regimental accounts, which is to say quickly and in service of a defensible position. He had been a good man. He had Cale's eyes. I carried the photograph not because I needed it to remember him, but because Kale deserved to have it, when she was old enough to want it. I woke Kale. She was already half awake. She slept lightly, always. She had her father's watchfulness about sounds in the night. I told her it was time. She sat up, reached under her bunk for the small bag she had packed herself 2 years ago and had updated every time I updated mine, and stood up and looked at me with a steadiness that still catches in my throat when I think about it. She was 9 years old, and she looked at me with the steadiness of someone who has decided not to be afraid because being afraid would not be useful. We went. The route to Shelter Hub 7 was 7 blocks. We had walked it in the drills. We knew every turn, every potential choke point, every alternative if the primary route was blocked. We were not the only people moving. The streets were populated with the particular purposeful quiet of a civilian population performing a practiced emergency. Everyone moving in their designated directions. Everyone doing the thing they had been trained to do. The great cooperative machinery of Cadian civil defense, functioning exactly as designed. For 4 blocks, it was fine. Then the artillery hit the Mechanicus relay station on Carno Street. I have read since, in the fragmentary records that survived, that this strike was not targeted at the relay station specifically, that it was part of a broader suppression pattern aimed at communications infrastructure across the mid-district. I understand this. I understand that from the perspective of the artillery battery that fired it, it was a coordinate on a grid, a point in a pattern, a means to an end. I understand that the mathematics of siege warfare requires this, that the individual locations cannot be considered individually, that the pattern is the thing. The collapse took out the access tunnel to Shelter Hub 7. Not the shelter itself. The shelter was intact, functioning, sealed and pressurized, and full of people who had arrived before us and were safe behind its blast doors. The tunnel that was the only surface-level access route from our district was blocked under approximately 12 meters of collapsed ferrocrete. I stood at the entrance to the collapsed tunnel and ran the arithmetic. The next nearest shelter hub with capacity was Hub 3, which was 11 blocks northwest, which required crossing Carno Street, which was currently, I could hear it, the sound carrying clearly through the morning air, under secondary artillery impact from the pattern that had taken out the relay station. The alternative route to Hub 3 added 6 blocks of exposure through an open commercial district. There was a maintenance access shaft 2 blocks east that connected to the under-district service corridor network, which I knew because it was part of my professional territory. I had worked in those corridors. I knew their layout. I knew that they ran approximately beneath Shelter Hub 4, which was on the far side of the district, 18 blocks from where we were standing. I had Kyle. I had my toolkit. I had 12 years of knowing what Kasser Gallen looked like underneath itself. I made the calculation. I told Kale what we were doing. I told her clearly with specifics, the shaft, the service corridor, the distance, the estimated time. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both practical. She took my hand. We moved. I want to tell you about the 3 hours in the service corridors, because they contain something that I think is important and that gets lost in most accounts of siege. Not the extraordinary things, not the moments of terror or miracle that make stories, but the texture of ordinary human effort applied to an extraordinary problem. The corridors were intact. The artillery above us registered as vibration, as sound, as falling dust from the junction seals. But the ferrocrete above us was thick, and the corridors had been built to survive exactly this, because the people who built Kasser Gallen 10,000 years ago understood that infrastructure must survive what the city above it cannot, that the machines must keep running even when everything else stops. I navigated by memory and by the maintenance markings I had spent 12 years learning to read. The system of codes and indicators that the administratum painted on junction walls to guide technicians through the labyrinthine sub-district network. Kyle stayed close, stayed quiet, asked questions when she genuinely didn't understand something, and otherwise trusted me to know where I was going. Which trust was the thing I was most careful not to betray. We found a blocked section at the 7 Gamma junction, a partial collapse, recent, the dust still settling, and I spent 40 minutes with my toolkit working at the blockage, while Kyle held the lumen and passed me implements, and observed the process with the focused attention she brought to everything she had decided was worth learning. She asked what I was doing as I did it. I told her. She understood more than a 9-year-old should have been able to understand. But she was Kale, and Kale was like that. We got through. At the 9 Delta junction, I found the first sign that something was wrong with the world above and beyond artillery. A maintenance door, standard issue, the kind with the manual release that requires a specific 3-step sequence that every administratum technician learns at certification. The door was open, not forced. The locking mechanism was intact and undamaged, which meant someone with technical knowledge had released it from inside. From inside the service corridor, going up, going toward the surface, at a point 3 blocks north of our position, during an active artillery barrage. I stood in front of the open door for a moment. The draft coming through it from above was carrying nothing unusual. Dust, smoke, the cold morning air of Cadia. No blood, no sound of distress. I noted it. I closed the door and relocked it and continued, because the calculation was still the calculation, and Hub 4 was still the destination, and noting an anomaly is not the same as being able to act on it. I did not tell Kale what I was thinking. She was watching my face. I gave her nothing to read. She squeezed my hand. She could always tell when I was giving her nothing to read. We emerged from the service corridor network at the 12 Epsilon access shaft at 1047 hours, having spent just under 4 hours beneath the city. The shaft brought us up into the base level of a civilian HAB block 2 blocks from Shelter Hub 4. I knew this building, had serviced its cogitator systems twice in the past 18 months, knew that the ground floor was a common area, knew that the shelter allocation for this block directed its residents to Hub 4. The building was empty, not damaged. The structure was intact. The common area was ordered, chairs at their tables, the communal Ricaf dispensary still operational and still heating, the notice board with its shelter allocation instructions and its civic information still pinned in place, the small ministorum shrine in the corner still lit by its tallow candles. Empty in the way the shrine had been empty, Marin would have recognized. The absence of people where people should be, without the traces of departure that departure leaves. No scattered belongings, no sign of panic or hurry, no indication that the emptiness was the result of people moving quickly away. Just the clean, complete negation of population, as though the building had been designed and furnished and operated, and then everyone who had ever been in it had simply been edited out. Kyle looked at it. She was 9 years old, and she did not say anything frightened. What she said, in the quiet observational voice she used when she was thinking aloud, was, "Where did everyone go?" I said I didn't know. She accepted this. She trusted me not to lie to her about the things I didn't know, as much as she trusted me to tell her the things I did. I checked the building systematically. Every floor, every apartment, same result. Meals on tables. Beds recently slept in. The accumulated material evidence of hundreds of lives interrupted at a specific moment and simply abandoned. Except that abandoned implies intention, and this showed no intention, no decision, no moment of choosing to leave, just stopping, mid-morning, mid-sentence, mid-cup of recaf, and being elsewhere. The Hub 4 blast doors were sealed, which meant they had received their full population, and locked down. The people of this building had not reached them. I returned to the ground floor. I sat Kyle at one of the common tables. I gave her the last of the ration blocks from the bag and watched her lick the sugar coating off the outside with the careful, methodical attention she always gave it. I thought about the open maintenance door at the 9 Delta Junction. I thought about what direction it opened. I did not let myself think past a certain point. Then I heard her. From the street outside, from the direction of the main avenue toward the north, from the direction that was not Hub 4 and was not anywhere we were supposed to be going, I heard Kyle's voice. I want to be absolutely precise about what I mean. Not a voice like Kale's voice. Not a voice that resembled Kale's voice in the way that fear manufactures resemblances from random input when it is primed to find a specific thing. Kale's voice, specifically, with the particular combination of timbre and cadence, and the faint nasality she'd had since a childhood respiratory infection that had left her sinuses slightly compromised, and that I had meant to have the medici look at when things were less, when things were quieter. Her voice, from outside, from the north, from the direction I had not come from. Kyle was sitting at the table behind me, eating her ration block. I crossed the common room in 5 steps. I stopped with my hand on the door. I stood there. I ran the arithmetic the way I had been running arithmetic all day. Root options, probability weights, risk calculations. I had been running arithmetic all day because arithmetic was the thing I had that was mine, the tool that had gotten me through the service corridors and around the block junction and out of the dark and this far. The arithmetic had no output for this. I opened the door. The avenue was quiet in the way that the city had been quiet all morning. The quiet of a place where the people have gone, where the sounds of urban life have been subtracted, and what remains is the structural sounds, the wind through the gaps in the walls, the distant percussion of artillery, the settling of damaged buildings finding their new equilibrium. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful, but is the shape that peace used to occupy. She was standing in the middle of the avenue. Kyle. My Kyle. Her height, her build, the dark braid I had plaited for her this morning before we left, the grey and tan civilian oversuit she had been wearing, her boots, both of them, her bag still on her back. Standing in the middle of the avenue, 40 meters from the building's entrance, in the strange lull between artillery cycles, in the thin, cold morning light of a Cadian autumn that was going to be the last autumn Cadia ever had. Standing and facing me, and perfectly still. I came out of the building. I stood on the step. My mind was doing the thing minds do when they receive information that requires 2 contradictory things to be true simultaneously. Running the verification loop, checking the input again, looking for the error in the data that would resolve the contradiction. The data kept returning the same result. Kyle was behind me in the building. Kyle was in front of me on the avenue. Both of these things were true. The arithmetic did not have a column for both of these things being true. I said her name. She turned her head. Look at me. The distance was 40 meters, enough to see clearly, not enough to read the small details of expression that I had learned over 9 years to read the way I read maintenance codes. In the dark, by touch. I could see her face. I could see her eyes. Her eyes were her eyes. This was what I kept returning to in the seconds that followed, in the long suspended moment of standing on that step, with my hand finding the wrench at my belt, without my having directed it there. Her eyes were her eyes. The brown of them, the particular alertness of them, the quality of attention they had always had, looking at the world with the focused curiosity of a person who thought questions were worth asking. Her eyes were her eyes. I stepped off the step. I walked toward her. I was telling myself things as I walked. Her eyes, her braid, her bag, her boots, both of them. The ration block she had just been eating. The hand that had squeezed mine in the service corridor. I was building a case from evidence the way I always built cases from evidence, because evidence was the only epistemology I had. At 3 meters, I stopped. I don't know why. I have asked myself this more times than I can count. In the years since, in the nights since, in the specific 3 a.m. quality of silence, where the question lives and refuses to be answered. There was no reason to stop. There was nothing wrong with what I could see. She was Kyle. The eyes were Kyle's eyes. The braid was the braid I had plaited this morning. The gap between her front teeth, just visible because her lips were parted slightly, just as it always was. 3 meters. My hand on the wrench. My feet are not moving. She tilted her head. The gesture was hers. The slight left tilt she always used when she was looking at something she was trying to understand, working it over, finding the question. A gesture so specific to her, so characteristic and unremarkable and absolutely hers, that it hit me in the chest with the force of something that should have been reassuring and was not. Was not. She said, "Mum, why are you afraid of me?" Kyle's voice. The slight nasality. The faint lisp on the F of afraid that she had been slowly losing as her palate developed, that was still present enough to be familiar. The genuine confusion in the question. Not performed confusion, not the kind of confusion that knows it isn't confusion, but the real kind. The kind that wants an answer because the answer is missing. My hand was on the wrench. My hand was on the wrench, and she was 3 meters away, and her eyes were her eyes, and the artillery had cycled back, and somewhere to the north something was burning, and from the building behind me, through the open door, I could hear nothing. Nothing at all. No small sounds of a child eating. No chair, no breathing. No the dozen tiny unconscious signals that a living person broadcasts into the space around them. No sounds at all. The wind moved down the avenue. The braid I had plaited this morning moved in the wind, the way it always moved, with the slight fraying at the end where Kyle had been picking at the binding since breakfast, because she was always picking at things she could reach. The fraying was right. The fraying was exactly right. 3 meters. My hand on the wrench. I looked at my daughter's face. I looked at her eyes. I looked at everything I could look at from 3 meters with all of my attention, and every piece of knowledge about her that 9 years had given me, and I held all of it simultaneously, and I did the arithmetic. The arithmetic gave me an answer. The arithmetic gave me the answer I had been refusing to let it reach since the moment I heard her voice from the wrong direction. Since the open door at the 9 Delta Junction. Since the empty building with the recaf still heating, and the lives still arranged on the tables as though the people had simply stopped being people and left the rest behind. The arithmetic gave me an answer, and I looked at my daughter's face, and I held the answer, and I did not move. She was still looking at me with that genuine confusion, still waiting for my answer, still wanting to understand why I was afraid, because she could not feel the answer in herself. Whatever she was now, whatever had happened to her in the time between the service corridor and this avenue, she was not performing as a child. She was a child. The eyes and the voice and the fraying braid and the question, asked in genuine confusion. She was all of that, completely, without gap or seam. Whatever was looking at me through my daughter's face did not know it was not my daughter. That was the most unbearable thing. Not the loss, not even the fear. The understanding that what was looking at me through those eyes was not malicious, was not a weapon pointed at me, was not the grinning, deliberate evil of a chaos entity wearing a stolen face. It was something that had found a shape it fit, or been poured into a shape, and had become that shape so completely that it did not know what it had replaced, did not know there was a difference between what it was and what it had been. It missed me. I could see it. Standing in the middle of the avenue in my daughter's body, it missed me, and it wanted me to stop being afraid, and it held its arms out. Kale's arms. Kale's reach. The reach she had used 1,000 times coming out of nightmares, coming in from the cold, coming home. 3 meters. My hand on the wrench. I looked at her face for a long time. Then I took a breath that I will feel in my lungs until I die. And I made the only choice that was mine to make. I'm not going to tell you what I did. You already know. You knew when my hand went to the wrench. You knew when the arithmetic gave its answer. I am telling you that I knew her. That I had 9 years of knowing her, and that knowing is not nothing. That it is the most real thing human beings have. The accumulated weight of specific knowledge about a specific person, the love that is made of detail rather than abstraction. I am telling you that I knew her, and I knew what the arithmetic said, and I made the choice. I am telling you that I held her in my mind exactly as she was. The teeth, the hands, the questions she asked that made me sit down and think. And I did not let go of her for 1 second of what followed. I did not let her be reduced to a variable. She was Kale. She was 9 years old. She was mine. I found a transport 3 hours later, one of the last civilian evacuation vehicles still running in the mid-district, organized by a Departamento Munitorum officer who had been doing the job with the flat competence of someone who has accepted that this is what there is left to do. I got on it. I had the photograph. I did not have the bag. I did not have the wrench. I sat in the transport and I looked at the photograph, and I did not say anything. And the transport moved, and Kasser-Gallon receded, and the sky above it was the wrong color, and the bells of some shrine somewhere were ringing, though I could not tell from which direction, and I did not look back. I did not look back. The laser gun was still on the ground where I had found it, in the middle of the avenue, still warm. It had been too big for her to carry far. Chapter 5. What Cadia Remembers. I've been asked what it felt like when the pylons fell. People ask me this the way they ask about explosions, expecting a sound, a light, a physical event with a before and an after that you can point to and say, there, that was the moment. That was when everything changed. They want a detonation, something that would justify the scale of what followed, something commensurate. What they don't want to hear is what actually happened, which was nothing. Nothing you could see, nothing you could measure with your body. I was on the transport, still ascending through the upper atmosphere, and the pylons fell, and I felt, not an explosion, not a rupture, not anything that my physical senses registered at all. What I felt was a silence underneath the silence. A silence that had been there, always, so constant and so complete that I had never noticed it. The way you don't notice the sound of your own heartbeat until the room goes quiet enough to hear it, except in reverse. Not a new sound emerging, an old one stopping. Something I didn't know I had. Some sense that lives beneath the senses. Some ancient buried thing that every human being carries in their nervous system, like a vestigial organ, whose function was forgotten 10,000 years ago, and whose function was this: maintaining the knowledge, wordless and continuous, that reality was real, that the ground was the ground, that the boundary between here and there was a boundary and not a suggestion, went quiet. Like a wall you have been leaning against your whole life, without knowing you were leaning, suddenly not being there. And in the space where it had been, in the silence of its absence, you understood for the first time what it was. It was the pylons. It was the pylons and everything the pylons had been holding at bay for 10,000 years, holding so completely, so consistently, so without drama or failure, that the holding had become invisible, had become reality itself, and now it had stopped, and what was real and what was not real were no longer separated by anything except your willingness to believe in the distinction. I have been trying to describe this to people for years. I have not yet found the right words. I don't think the right words exist in any language that was built inside the boundary the pylons maintained, because language built inside a structure cannot describe what the structure was. You need to be outside it, and there is no outside. There is no longer an outside. There is only what came after. My name doesn't matter. What I was on Cadia doesn't matter. Not in the way that Sister Marin's habit matters, or Colonel Heth's rank, or Epistolary Calthus's 4 centuries, or Isolde's wrench. I was none of those things. I was a transport worker. I drove vehicles. I moved things from where they were to where they needed to be, which is not a heroic function, but is the function that keeps everything else possible. And I did it for 16 years on Cadia, and I am still doing it now, somewhere else, in the broken galaxy that Cadia's fall made. I am telling you this story because I was there for all of it, in the way that transport workers are there for all of it, present at the edges, moving through the spaces between the significant moments, carrying the people who carried the weight. I saw Marin's shrine from the outside, its bells ringing in the dark with no one to ring them. I drove past the Manufacturum district, where the 8th Cadian's line had been, and saw what the street looked like afterward. I passed close enough to the northern perimeter to hear, not see, hear, the work that Epistolary Calthus was doing in the last hours, the sound of a Space Marine psyker holding a line with everything he had, and knowing what he was holding it against. I was not a witness to these things in any official sense. I was not debriefed. I was not asked. I am telling you now because the official record does not contain what I know, and what I know should not be lost, and I am still here, which is not something I can fully explain and which I try not to think too hard about, because the arithmetic of survival on that day has no clean solution, and I have made my peace with carrying the remainder. I saw the laser gun. I need to say this first, before everything else, because the laser gun is where this story begins and ends, and I did not understand that until much later, and I want you to understand it now, before I tell you what I know about each of them. I saw it twice, once before I understood what it was, and once after. The second time was the last thing I saw before the transport lifted clear of Cadia's atmosphere, and I have been seeing it every day since, in the particular way that certain images settle into permanent residence in the mind and do not leave, and do not dim. A laser gun. Child-sized grip, because it was not a combat weapon, it was a defender's personal arm, shorter than the standard issue, the kind assigned to civilian auxiliary volunteers, who would never be expected to hold a line, but might be expected to contribute to one. Lying in the middle of a Casa Galan Avenue, in the dust and the thin autumn light, still warm. It had been too big for her to carry far. Her name was Kale. She was 9 years old. She had found it beside a fallen defender, and she had picked it up, and she had been carrying it back toward the fighting, toward the soldiers who could use it. Because she was Cadian, and Cadian children understand from the time they can walk that every resource has a use, and waste is a form of surrender. She had been carrying a weapon she could barely lift toward a battle she could not fight, because it was the thing there was to do, and she was the person there was to do it. That is what Cadia was. That is what 10,000 years of living at the edge of annihilation produces in a people. Not soldiers only, not warriors only. A civilization that metabolizes sacrifice so completely, so early, that a 9-year-old picks up a weapon she cannot carry and carries it anyway. The laser gun was still warm when Isolde found it. Isolde left it there. I know why. Let me tell you what I know about Sister Marin Ossiel. I will not tell you what was in the vault beneath the vault. Not because I don't know, but because there is a category of knowledge that changes the person who holds it, and I do not have the right to make that change in you without your consent. And your consent requires knowing what you are consenting to, and knowing what you are consenting to is the change itself. And this is a loop I have sat with for years and not resolved. I will tell you what I believe, which is this. What Marin found in the vault was not a daemon, was not a warp entity, not a manifestation of chaos, not any of the things that the ecclesiarchy's demonological taxonomy would provide a name and a protocol for. The ecclesiarchy's taxonomy is built on the assumption that what comes out of the warp is an enemy, that the immaterium is a hostile place whose contents are hostile contents and whose relationship to humanity is the relationship of darkness to light, of corruption to purity, of the thing that must be burned to the fire that burns it. What Marin found was not an enemy. It was the same thing Kalthus had found, in the gap of his missing memory, in the old language he had spoken without knowing he knew it. The same thing that had been watching him for 4 centuries. The same patient presence that had found him fond, had found him worth watching, had found the small burning thing worth the attention of something that was old before the pylons were built. It had been in the vault. It had been in the reliquary. It had been in the bone of the saint, in the gold and crystal housing, in the prayer that Marin had been sending into that silence for 23 years, and that had been received and returned and received again in a conversation that was not the conversation she thought she was having. She had been praying to the Emperor. She had not been praying into empty space, but what had been listening was not only what she believed was listening. And in the morning, the bells rang for the last time, with the sky changed and the refugees in the nave, and the gates sealed, and the vault below her feet occupied by something that had finally, after 300 years, decided it was time to introduce itself. Marin had felt the difference, had felt for the first time the distinction between the presence she had known and the presence that was now making itself visible. And the difference was not the difference between the holy and the profane, between the sacred and the corrupt, between the Emperor's light and the warp's dark. The difference was scale. What was in the vault was not corrupted. It was not evil. It was something so far outside the categories of holy and evil that the categories were like a child's drawing of a map, gesturing at territory that is real, but bearing no useful relationship to the actual terrain. Marin completed her prayer. She rose. She climbed the stairs. She did not run. She never ran. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she survived what was coming up those stairs toward her. I know that when I drove past the shrine 2 hours later, the bells were still ringing, and the gates were still sealed, and the light in the tower windows was not the light of lumens. I choose to believe she held. I choose to believe that because the alternative, that there is nothing worth holding, is not a belief I can carry and still do the work of getting people from where they are to where they need to be. Some beliefs are not conclusions, they are tools. Marin understood this better than anyone. I choose to believe she held. I will tell you about Colonel Heth now, and I will tell you in the only way that honors what he was, which is to tell you what he did in the last hour of the last Vox transmission that anyone received from the 8th Cadian Regiment. I have the transmission. A fragment of it. 17 minutes. The last 17 minutes of a longer recording that begins in the middle of a sentence and ends in the middle of a different one, which tells you something about how the recording was captured and something about how it ended. I have listened to it more times than I can count. In the years since, in the quiet of transit holds and loading bays, and all the various silences that a transport worker accumulates. He was not transmitting to command. There was no command. The Vox silence had been total for 6 hours, and he knew it, and he was transmitting anyway, which is either the behavior of a man in denial or the behavior of a man who has redefined what transmission means and found a recipient that doesn't require a functioning network. He was transmitting to Cadia, to the world, to the stone and the cold air and the 10,000 years of people who had lived and died on it, to the accumulated weight of a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the function of holding a line, and had held it and was holding it still in the only form holding was possible now, which was the form of knowing exactly what you were losing and losing it with your eyes open. He was naming his regiment, every soldier, every name, in the flat, precise, unhurried voice of a man who has accepted that this is the last thing he will do and has decided to do it completely. Private Jens Carroll, Corporal Thesane, Sergeant Vielle, Lieutenant Casper. Name after name after name, delivered with the specific weight of a man who has spent 22 years learning to carry people in his memory and is now setting them down, carefully, in the only place he can be sure they will rest. He spoke for 11 minutes before the recording reaches the names I recognize. The men from his immediate command, the ones whose service records I have cross-referenced against the regimental rolls that survive. He had been speaking before the fragment began. He had been naming them all. At the 16-minute mark, his voice changes. Not breaks, does not break. Changes. A shift in register, a fraction of a degree. The kind of change that you would not notice if you were not listening for it, and that I noticed because I have listened to those 17 minutes more times than I should have. A shift that is not emotion exactly, but is the voice discovering, mid-sentence, the edge of what it can carry. He says, Private First Class Eddies. He says it the way he has said every other name, flat even, precisely weighted. Then he pauses. 2 seconds, 3. Then he says very quietly, still in control, still Heth. He had a photograph of his mother. He kept it behind his identification tag. I should have told him I knew that. 1 more second. Then he continues. The next name. The same voice. The same precision. The recording ends 40 seconds later, mid-name, which tells you everything you need to know about how the 8th Cadian's last hour ended, and nothing you did not already understand. I have never been able to identify whose name he was saying when the recording cut. I have decided this is appropriate, that the incompleteness is part of the truth, that a record which ended cleanly, with a final name and a final silence and a sense of completion, would be a lie about what happened there. The truth is that it ended mid-name, mid-sentence, mid-act, because that is how things end when the enemy does not wait for you to finish. The gate held for 22 years of his life. He held it for every second of those 22 years, in every form that holding was possible for one man to perform. The gate held because men like Heth held it. The gate fell because the gate was never the point. I will tell you what Epistolary Calthus said in the 3 seconds before his recording ended. I will tell you because the translation has circulated since, in fragments, in whispers, among people who deal in the kind of knowledge that the Imperium officially does not possess and unofficially cannot stop accumulating. I will tell you because the question he asked was one that every conscious being asks eventually, in some form, in some language, whether or not they have 4 centuries of psychic discipline to formulate it with precision. He asked, is anything watching? Not in the sense of surveillance, not in the sense of security or protection, or the theological question of whether the Emperor's gaze extends to this particular moment, in this particular place. Not that question, though that question is inside it. The larger question, the oldest question, The one that the darkness asks back at you when you have been awake long enough and alone enough and honest enough to stop filling the silence with answers you brought with you. Is anything watching? Is there a witness to this? Is the suffering and the holding and the names on the roster and the photograph behind the identification tag and the child with the laser gun, is any of it received by anything? Does it register? Does it matter? Not in the utilitarian sense of mattering, not in the sense of having tactical value or strategic consequence or a place in the historical record, but in the absolute sense. In the sense that would still be true if no one survived to write it down. He asked. He received an answer. I will not tell you what the answer was. Not because I don't know. I know in the way that everyone who was on Cadia that day and was paying a certain kind of attention knows. The answer having written itself into the air and the stone and the broken sky in a language that is not language and does not require literacy. I will not tell you because the answer is not mine to give. It is his. It arrived for him, specifically, in his specific 400-year-old specific human and transhuman consciousness, in response to his specific question, and whatever it was, it changed the character of how he held the perimeter in the hours that followed. He did not stop holding the perimeter, he held it differently. I drove past the northern perimeter at 1400 hours. I could not see him. Space Marines are not easily visible from a transit vehicle at a distance, and the smoke was heavy by that point, and the light was the wrong light. But I could hear, and what I heard was not the sound of a line collapsing. It was the sound of a line that had decided what it was, and was being that thing completely, without remainder, without reservation, past the point where the mathematics of the situation supported it. I don't have a tactical word for what I heard. I have only the word that arrived in me when I heard it, which is the word witness. He was witnessing. The act of holding the line had become an act of witnessing, standing present, eyes open, refusing to look away from what was happening and what was being lost, insisting on the reality of every name, on every roster, even as the roster was reduced, because reality insisted upon is the only reality that does not dissolve when the pylons fall. I don't know if he survived. The records from the northern perimeter in the final hours are incomplete in the specific way that records are incomplete when there is no one left to complete them. I know that when the Cicatrix Maledictum tore open the sky, when the Great Rift split the galaxy from one end to the other, and the darkness that the pylons had been suppressing for 10,000 years finally found its expression in the material universe. I know that in the moment of the tearing, in the 17 seconds when every psyker on Cadia experienced the answer to Kalthas's question simultaneously, the northern perimeter had not yet fallen. It had not yet fallen. That is what I know. I will tell you about Isolde last. I will tell you briefly, because the thing she did does not require elaboration. It requires only acknowledgement, which is a different thing. The act of saying, this happened, this was real, this person stood in this moment and made this choice. And the choice was made with full knowledge of what was being lost. And it was the only choice that the arithmetic supported, and she made it, the wrench. She made a choice. The only choice was hers to make. I will not dress it in language that makes it larger or smaller than it was. I will not call it mercy. Mercy implies that the recipient suffers, and I don't know if what was in the avenue suffered or could. I will not call it loss. Loss implies that what she chose to end was what she loved, and it was not. It was the shape of what she loved. The detail-perfect, fraying braid, ration block sugar-coating shape of what she loved, worn by something that did not know it was wearing a shape and not being one. She knew the difference. She made the choice that the difference required. She got on the transport with the photograph, and without the bag, and without the wrench, and sat down, and the transport moved, and she did not look back. I drove that transport. I know what she looked like in the cargo hold, in the grey light, with the photograph in her hands. I know because I checked on the civilians every 20 minutes as we ascended, because that is the job. You check, you verify, you account for the people in your care. I looked through the cargo hold viewport at 30-second intervals. She was sitting completely still. Her hands were in her lap, the photograph face down against her palms. Her eyes were open. Her face was, this is the best word I have for it, honest. There was nothing in it that wasn't true. No performance of composure, no management of expression, no armor. Just a face that had looked at the worst thing it would ever see and had not looked away and was now carrying the seeing. She never looked at the photograph. Not once, in the hour it took to clear the atmosphere. The photograph was in her hands, and she held it, and she did not look at it. I think she was keeping it for later, for the moment when she had the capacity to look at it the way it deserved to be looked at, fully, without flinching, with everything she had. She was saving that moment, protecting it. She was Cadian. Even in this, she was Cadian, making her resources last, keeping something in reserve, not spending what she couldn't afford to spend before it was needed. I did not speak to her. I checked on her every 20 minutes. She was always still. She was always honest. She was always there. I am speaking to you from what the Administratum now calls the Indomitus era. The Indomitus era. They named it that, Latin-rooted, ancient-sounding. The Imperium's habit of wrapping its catastrophes in the linguistic clothing of endurance, of persistence, of things that will not yield. Indomitus, unconquered. The galaxy has a scar now, a wound that runs from one edge to the other, a tear in the material universe where the warp bleeds through, in a permanent storm that has been growing since the pylons fell, and has not stopped growing, and will not stop growing until something stops it, which is a task that the Indomitus Crusade is attempting, which is why the Emperor's Regent is moving across the stars with an army that has not been assembled since the Great Crusade, which is why humanity is doing what humanity always does when the darkness presses hardest against the windows, holding the line. I want to tell you what that costs, not in the regimental sense, not in the strategic sense, in the Isolde sense, in the Heth sense, in the specific human unit sense that the official records will not tell you, because the official records speak in aggregates, and aggregates are how you avoid the arithmetic. Cadia held for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of a civilization that put its children to drill before they could read, that built its culture around the single function of standing between humanity and annihilation, that produced, generation after generation after generation, the people who walked into the manufactorum and named their dead, and went down to vaults where something old was waiting, and picked up lephistals too heavy to carry, and carried them anyway. 10,000 years. It was not enough. I have thought about this every day since Cadia fell. I have thought about whether 10,000 years of sacrifice that ends in the thing it was sacrificed to prevent constitutes what? Failure. Waste. A tragedy in the classical sense, the one where the fall is built into the premise from the beginning, and everything that happened in between was the shape that the fall took on its way down. I have thought about it, and I have arrived, after years of thinking, at the only answer I have, which is this: it was not a failure. It was the longest success in human history, and it ended. Those are two different things. The ending does not retroactively hollow the success. The falling of the gate does not unmake the 10,000 years of holding it. The darkness that came through does not reach back through time and undo Heth's names or Marin's prayers or Calthus's questions, or the 9-year-old girl who picked up a laser gun and carried it because that was the thing there was to do. The darkness does not get to do that. This is not a comforting thought. I want to be clear about that. I am not offering comfort. Comfort would require the suggestion that the sacrifice was worth it, that the cost balanced the outcome, that if you lay the losses against the gains, the equation comes out even. It does not even come out. It will never come out even. The arithmetic is permanently, catastrophically imbalanced, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you the Ministorum version, which is beautiful and false. What I am offering is not comfort. What I am offering is the only thing I have, which is the truth of what I saw. I saw people hold a line that was always going to fall. I saw them hold it with everything they had, past the point where the mathematics supported it, past the point where the evidence justified it, past the point where any rational accounting of cost and benefit would have released them from the obligation. I saw them hold it with their names and their prayers and their questions and their wrenches, and I saw the line fall, and I saw the darkness come through, and I am still here, which is not something I fully understand, and the darkness is still spreading, and humanity is still holding lines, and somewhere in the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium cut off from Terra by the Cicatrix Maledictum, the half that the official records now call the Dark Imperium, the half where the light of the Astronomicon does not reach and the box does not carry, and the supply lines do not run, and the worlds do not know if the Imperium they are defending still exists. Somewhere in that half, there are soldiers who have never heard of Cadia, who do not know what the pylons were, who have no knowledge of the price that was paid to buy the 10,000 years that ended the year before their birth. And they are holding their lines anyway. I find this. I do not have a single word for what I find it. I have several words that each capture a part of it. Terrible, necessary, honest, worthy of a witness. It is worthy of witness. That is what I can offer. That is the only thing I have ever been able to offer in the years since the transport lifted and Cadia receded below me, and the sky above it was the wrong color, and the scar was beginning to form in the galaxy's face. Witness. Say the names. Say Marin and Heth and Calthas and Isolde and Kyle. Say the corporals and the sergeants and the transport workers and the cogitator technicians and the 9-year-old girls carrying las pistols they cannot hold. Say them clearly, without the armor of aggregates, without the distance of regimental numbers and casualty statistics, and the administratum's talent for converting people into data. Say their names. The darkness will come regardless. Say them anyway. The laser gun is still there, on the avenue, in the dust, in what used to be Casa Galan on what used to be Cadia, which is now a debris field, in a system that the charts mark with a skull and a notation that reads, "Exterminate us by chaos action, no recovery recommended." The laser gun is still there because it is not there anymore. Because the concept of there requires a ground, and the ground requires a planet, and the planet requires the pylons, and the pylons required the people who built them, who are older than memory and further gone than distance, and all of it held as long as it held and then stopped, but she carried it. Before it stopped, before the line fell and the scar opened and the darkness came through. She picked it up and she carried it, a 9-year-old in both boots and a fraying braid, carrying a weapon toward people who could use it because that was the thing there was to do. Kyle, that was her name. Say it. The darkness does not get to have it. Say it. Hollow voxers. The gate held because they held it. Hold the line.